Good evening and welcome to Burnsville Park and National Resource Commission meeting for April 1st, 2013. The first item of business is to approve an agenda for this evening. Commissioners, do you have any item to add for the agenda? Hearing none. Staff, is there any item to add to the agenda for today?
Nothing from staff, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner, would you like to make a motion to approve the agenda?
Make a motion to approve.
Second.
Anyone who's in favor will say yay.
Yeah.
Motion approved. The next item is the citizens' comments. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to address? Seeing none, we'll move to the third item. Minutes for our March 4th meeting. Commissioner, any revision to the meeting of March 4th meeting? Hearing none. Staff?
No revisions from staff.
Good. That's for that. Would you like to please make a motion to approve the minutes for March 4th meeting?
So moved. Second.
Second. Anyone? Please say aye or...
Aye.
Aye.
Motion approved. The fourth one is considering a recommendation regarding the proposed policies for vending in the park. JJ will present from the city.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, Commissioners. I'm before you tonight to bring back a draft policy regarding information on vending in the parks. And when I get through the information I have, I'll be looking for you to make a recommendation that we move the proposed policy on to the City Council for their approval at their April 16th meeting. So again, I know, Commissioners, some of you were absent from the March meeting, so I'm just going to walk you through very briefly how we got to this point. Last summer, we received a request from a mobile food truck to vend in our parks on a long-term basis. We did not have the right policies or ordinances in place to allow that to happen. The topic was brought up and discussed with Council at a work session back in June last summer. And at the time, Council asked us to provide them with more information. So we did some research, talked to other communities from around the state to find out what they are doing and how they're working with mobile food trucks and mobile food vendors in their community. That information or that survey, those results were available to you at the last meeting. I think you're probably somewhere still in some packet information that you might have from your March meeting. After that, we brought back that information to City Council in February of this year, and they discussed, or we talked about some of the key elements that we felt were necessary to have in this draft policy and in our ordinances. They liked the direction we were headed and asked us to then bring the policy through the proper channels, which is bringing this draft policy before you tonight. Back in March, you had the first glimpse at it, or the last glimpse at it, and you provided us with some feedback on things you would like to see, or maybe some ideas on things we might have left out. And I'm going to walk you through all of those things tonight. So, with that, again, what's changed from the draft policy to the policy that you now have in your background? We originally had or listed all of our community parks as possible vending locations for these mobile food trucks or peddlers. Since then, we've looked at our parks and our community parks and really tried to figure out if it makes sense for that park based on the types of uses that were happening there or based on the available parking and what we really had there. So, for example, Sunset Park, community park, but a very tiny parking lot to allow a food truck vendor to take up 2 or 3 or 4 stalls there over the lunch hour when a lot of people are trying to use that park to get their walk in just really doesn't make any sense. So we've identified 13 locations in 12 of our parks where we would allow essentially a vending pad for mobile food units to vend in our park system. And those locations are identified in the draft of the policy in front of you. We also had discussions on peddlers, and the difference here being, again, a peddler goes from place to place rather quickly, serving maybe prepackaged food items. Think of the Blue Bunny ice cream truck, rather than a mobile food unit that shows up and sets up for the day or for the lunch hour or evening rush. That's the difference that we're trying to identify here. And so we added some specific language in this draft policy to combine peddlers and mobile food units in the parks at the same time without creating, too many vendors or too few spots for people to be there to enjoy the park without having a food truck or peddler in the park at the same time. Again, vendors operating on a first-come, first-served basis. When we talked last month, and we had a lot of discussion about this, we talked that it was going to be very labor-intensive for staff to control which vendors were going to be at which park, which day, which time of day, and how that would all balance out and how it would all be fair to each vendor paying the same fee. In some discussions I had with the two mobile food units that have been meeting with City Council, they both felt that it was absolutely fine to operate on a first-come, first-served basis. So they didn't see any issue with that. It's operated the same way in Minneapolis. They were absolutely comfortable with that idea. So quite honestly, for us, after we took a look at that, it would really make things a lot easier to allow that situation to happen that way. Back in March, when I was before you, we didn't have a proposed fee for this type of vending. It was still in discussion. We were really still trying to feel it out for what other communities are doing, what's a right number, what's the wrong number, too high, too low. And we've come to an annual fee, an annual permit fee to vend in the parks of $500. Additionally, currently in our fee structure, we have a $55 per day rate. Obviously, if you do the math, you're going to be better off at some point doing the annual fee than you would be a daily rate. And that's really what we're trying to do. I don't want to, again, we want to make it easier on staff to manage these food vending trucks in our system. And as I say there, the last bullet point, less responsibility for staff, again, keeping track of which vendors are going to be in which park, which day. That's what we're trying to eliminate some of the workload on our Parks and Recreation staff. So with that, I think these were the concerns that you addressed or brought up at your March meeting. And again, top of the list, I put the managing of the vendor calendar and how we would do that. Again, I think we've accomplished that by allowing the first-come, first-served policy to take place here. And then one of the other items you've addressed or asked us to take a look at is consider putting vendors' schedules on our city website. Again, in talking with the vendors that we've had before us at city council meetings, they run their own websites. They feel that their social media feeds is what really drives their business. And so they'll take care of their own customers. All we would really need to do from our website is to provide a link to that vendor's website or to their social media feed, whatever it might be. So we may not have a calendar on the cityofburnsville.org webpage, but we could certainly provide a link to, hey, we've identified whatever it might be, 5 vendors that will be in our city parks. If you are interested in finding lunch or dinner options from these vendors, please follow them at this link or that link. So I think we can accommodate them that way. You've also asked us to take a look at considering higher permit fees for weekend or holidays. At the time, it was a great idea and really one that we took a look at. But again, trying to manage, I guess, the calendar in a sense is really going to be a lot of work. And so doing it with an annual permit fee will be much easier for staff to manage at this point. One of the things you also brought up is that we should include a penalty for non-compliance. And again, in that draft policy, we've added language under the duration section, which includes suspension or termination of their permit, their park vending permit, if they do not follow guidelines set forth in the policy. And again, that's a thank you to this group here for recognizing that was omitted from the first draft policy. And then the last thing you asked us to do was explore providing a sales tax levy on these vending operations in partnership with a fee or whatever it might be. Our finance department tells me we cannot do that without first getting state legislatures to approve of that sales tax for this, one item. And quite frankly, when we take a look at it, they're not bringing in millions and millions of dollars, so I don't know that it would really be worth it at this time to pursue that idea any farther. But it can be done if commissioners want that to happen. So with that, commissioners, I've given you the quick details. I know you have some Emerald Ash Borer plans you'd like to look at later tonight, but that's the sum of the vending in the parks background policy, draft policy that you've had before you now for the last 2 months. I'll stand for questions if any commissioners have one.
Mr. Chair, JJ, the only question I have is that in the concessions areas that are there now, their food is fairly limited to, I guess, hot dogs and hamburgers and that kind of thing. The vendors do offer, some of them that I've seen, other kinds of food other than hot dogs and hamburgers. Burnsville is noted for being a proactive city for health and sustainability, and this might be something to think about for the future, that in the high schools, the kids get fairly good food, which is balanced, and it has food that not normally would be found at a concession stand. And the population of Burnsville now, there are a lot of folks that would not be able to get any kind of food from the concession stands, such as vegetarians or others who have, food restrictions. So just like to bring up the issue for you to talk about sometime in the future about upgrading the concession stands, because it isn't fair that unless people eat meat and things like that, they get the good food and folks have whatever is left, like popcorn or peanuts or whatever they may be having. So I think it would be a really good gesture to our very diverse community of families with kids to offer that. So I'm not suggesting we do that tomorrow, maybe the day after, but at some point when the concession stand issues are reviewed, maybe it's time to upgrade them, such as the ballpark downtown. I forget the name of the ball team that's playing, but they've picked up on that, and maybe something we might think about.
We'll keep that in mind. I believe that's one of the council members mentioned that maybe some of these mobile food units could provide healthier or different options when they're in the parks. So I think that's right in line with what you're trying to tell me here tonight. But we can certainly take a look at the concession operations that we handle to see if we can do anything to provide healthier options.
I'm wondering if anyone agrees, or if you could give businesses headquartered in Burnsville a break on the fee. Just if it doesn't have to be a huge thing, but maybe like $10 off the daily fee or something if you're headquartered in Burnsville. I don't know if anyone agrees with that, or this is something.
Sure. You know what? We did take a look at resident and non-resident rates, and we do have other examples in our recreation fee policy where we do have a resident or non-resident rates. It's usually a slight benefit to be a resident, $10 off a shelter reservation or something like that. Again, we could take a look at that, but at this point we just identified the one $500 annual permit rate. I know that the one mobile food unit that we did have operating based out of Burnsville is going to no longer be operating their mobile food unit. So I don't know that we have any at this point in time to be concerned about, but we can certainly take a look at that if commissioners would want to or would favor a resident and non-resident rate. We could certainly provide some discounted rate for a resident business, if that's what you desire.
I could just add on to that, Commissioners, one thing to keep in mind with these mobile food units is they don't really pay any local tax other than if they happen to live in the community and they store their truck there, but they don't have brick and mortar business anywhere. So they pay property tax if they live here. If they don't, they're just really passing through. So,
Mr. Chair, one quick question. What happens with a vendor that does not show? He has it on his page, and he says, "Okay, I'm just not going to show up." And I'm just wondering what you do in that particular situation where people now are expecting someone to be there, and they're not.
Commissioner Dedze, I would argue that it's on that business owner to be there for his customers. If a vendor shows up or doesn't show up when they say they're going to be at Loch Levon Park that night, and some of our residents show up to eat their food, I would imagine those residents would be upset with the vendor and not necessarily upset with the city park and rec staff. But I could be wrong on that.
I'm only commenting on that because as a resident, I wouldn't know who really. I would look at the city because it's on city land, and that I expected the vendor really to be there.
Okay.
And especially if it's first come, first serve, and if a vendor has multiple locations and doesn't show up, you could have some issues. I'm just wondering if that's been addressed at all.
You know, Commissioner Dedze, it has not, and I'm sorry, maybe I wasn't understanding the question fully. Again, a lot of the vendors that we're talking about use social media as their way of getting the word out where they are located. So they probably wouldn't send out that tweet or update their Facebook post with where they're going to be until they are actually in that location or have secured that spot for the day.
Okay, so if I understand this right, that basically is a person using that park expecting, getting the idea that someone's going to be there, we have no assurance that they will be there.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
We are not scheduling a mobile food unit in each of the 12 locations or 13 locations that we've identified each and every night or every day.
Any other comments, questions? None? Is there a motion that we need to?
Commissioners, we are asking that you consider a motion recommending approval of the policy, if you're so inclined.
I'll make such a motion.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion passed. Next, we will be moving to item 5, which is review proposal update to Burnsville Emerald Ash Borer Management Plan. Terry, would you be?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioners, I'll kick this off briefly from my seat, if that's allowed. I just want to point out that we worked with you and City Council to come up with a Emerald Ash Borer Management Plan back in 2010. I think many of you were a part of that discussion. So really, what we're looking at tonight is an update of that earlier plan. So much of the plan still remains in place. With the original plan, we estimated that there were about 12,000 public ash trees, in that we would be looking at removing and replacing those at an estimated cost of about $14 million. We have good news to share tonight in that we have, we have a little over 14,000 ash trees in total if you include the woodland areas. But what we're suggesting is that the woodland areas can be left to kind of naturally manage themselves, and we'll just allow those trees to die, and we'll get into that more. But the revised numbers are there are about 4,000 public ash trees that we need to manage. And that price tag has gone down, as we will share with you later, to around $3.5 to $4 million rather than $14 million. If you agree with the new plan that we're going to share with you this evening. So much of the plan, again, is information that you've seen before. We've been working with Rainbow Tree Care to add tree inventory information into the plan. One of the first items, the top priority for the 2010 plan, was to complete an inventory of our public trees. And of course, as part of that inventory, we now not only know how many ash trees we have, but what all of our trees are and their condition at this point. So any of the public trees, we have a very good inventory of all of that. So at this time, we wanted to fold that inventory information into the plan and then take a look at our strategies, because there's been a lot of new information that's come out. We're actually finding that treating ash trees is a more cost-effective way to handle it, so we're going to suggest that we treat more ash trees and remove fewer, and we'll share that information with you as we move forward here. I guess at this point, I would like to turn the presentation over to Joel Spies. He is one of the consultants from Rainbow Tree Care that has been working with us. Joel also travels around the country a bit, talking about emerald ash borer, and one of our local experts. He lives right here in Burnsville, so he has an interest in seeing us come up with a well-thought-out plan. And I know he's on kind of the cutting edge of what's going on, so I asked him to start out with just a little bit of an update on what's happening with EAB. So, Joel?
Well, thank you tonight. As Terry said, I am a Burnsville resident, so I have a little bit more passion maybe for what we do than maybe some of the other cities I've worked with. Give you a little background real quick. Rainbow Tree Care Scientific is the division of Rainbow Tree Care I work with, and we work with universities, other tree care companies, cities, and government entities around the country developing tree health care protocols. And with emerald ash borer, we got started about 2005, 2006. So we've been on some of the forefront with dealing with this, from management strategies, treatment strategies, and best practices. So that gives a little background. And a lot of the knowledge I'm going to share here in the beginning is collected from different areas in the country. So if you haven't seen emerald ash borer, here's probably the closest you'll ever see one. It's actually a pretty cool little bug if you're an entomologist. It's got the metallic back. It is not a native pest to the U.S. It's similar to some of our native borers, but it is an invasive flathead borer from Asia. And in this map here that you're looking it's somewhat current. They've put out some new ones. This is from October of 2012, and you can see it originally came in Michigan, and is, in the last 10, 15 years has moved clear across the country. And in 2009 is when we first received it here in the Twin Cities Metro. A little bit more detailed. This is a current map off the MDA's website, and each one of those plus sign figures are new finds. So these are identified, confirmed EAB locations. And so what does that really mean for Burnsville? If you look at Burnsville, this is an 8-mile roughly circle, and you can see we are well within new find locations. That black dot epicenter that you see there is Fort Snelling, and that site was found last September. And that location was anywhere from 3 to 5 years old. That tree was riddled with larvae feeding all the way down into the root flares. So it became a big concern, and that's where I'd been working with Terry with this, trying to just keeping him up to date with latest information. And this was some of a wake-up call that it's something that we really need to deal with, or start looking at how we deal with it. And then when you line that up with Burnsville's high ash population in the river hills and there along the river and up to those early community or the building areas of the community, it's a concern. And is EAB here? Good question. That's always the million-dollar question we get around the country. Because of its life cycle and how it shows up, it's where we find it may not necessarily be where it is. And as you know, the Fort Snelling site was probably similar to some of those sites up in Minneapolis that you see up where all the dots are, about the same age. It's really tough to find. And so you have to kind of look in. It's probably in Burnsville, or at least along the river. We just haven't found it, would be my guess. So that to that, how do they kill the tree without getting, spending a lot of time on their life cycle and stuff? Basically, they lay an egg up in the canopy. That egg hatches, they bore into the tree, and at the larvae stage, they feed on the tree's water-conducting tissues. So you can see there the photo in the bottom right's just kind of 3 different stage developments of the larvae, and then you can see the feeding that they've done, and they just totally destroy that vascular system. And that photo is actually the tree from Fort Snelling. So you can see it was all the way down into the trunk. And I believe this winter they removed that tree and the rest of the ones that were on the golf course there and surrounding areas, the city did. And one of the key aspects that you have to understand with emerald ash borer, it kills all ash trees. This isn't like Dutch elm disease or oak wilt or some other challenges that we face with our trees. In the community, when it comes in, it kills every ash tree. There is no, random few trees left here and there, and that's one of the huge impacts as you'll see with emerald ash borer. I mentioned earlier the symptoms are tough to find. The 3 photos I just slid up here, all of those trees are infested with emerald ash borer. And you can see there in year 1, that tree looks fine. Looks like a healthy tree that you would, you wouldn't even think twice about even looking for emerald ash borer. Year 2, there's a little thinning. The tree's a little chlorotic, but that doesn't look any different than most trees that you would see in mid to late summer. Year 3, 4 is when people start, calling the city. They start calling arborists, landscapers, and want to know what's going on. And at that point, it's too late. And this is probably the biggest challenge with emerald ash borer, is finding it in time to be able to react. This is another tree. I took this in Columbus, Ohio a couple summers ago. In that parking lot, there are standing dead ash trees, and this tree looks totally fine. And then when you look to the photo to the right there where the bark cracking is, you can see, if you get up close, you can see the larvae underneath the bark. It's where it's dried out in the tree. So, that tree would have probably died, if not yet into that summer the next year. This always gets people's attention. This is from Toledo. This is from Dr. Dan Herms, entomologist at Ohio State, one of our partners with research. Once the beetle population builds up, you get what now they're calling the exponential death curve, and the trees die rapidly. And it's just not one. And I'll show some more photos and explain how that happens coming up. But this is pretty impactful. So with EAB, with larvae, how does the population build up? So this is a little mathematical formula just to give you some perspective of how we know it takes a while for the signs to show up. So the beetles are here, they're breeding, they're reproducing, and how does it build up so quick that we don't start just seeing a few trees die every so often? So if you use this math, we know that from research, they lay anywhere from 70 to 90 eggs, high survival rate. And you start laying that out over time, this is what shows up. One tree, we know it feeds on the tree, that's its life cycle. Very little, if any, signs in the tree from that. One female can turn into 3,200 viable eggs the following year. Year 3, 128,000. Year 4, 5 million. Year 5, 204 million, and so on and so on. That population buildup is what ends up killing the trees rapidly. And so that's really what's shown up probably from when you originally did your plan, and was it 2010 was the original plan, to now the researchers have really identified what they're calling this exponential death curve and the rapid die-off. And one of the reasons that it was hard to find this when EAB first showed up in Detroit in 2002 was the U.S. Forest Service had a quarantine and removal process. So they came in and removed every ash tree within 2 miles of a new site. That made it really tough to really know what the natural impact's going to be, because we were just removing so many trees so fast. Well, the government ran out of money. So when it got to Toledo and in Ohio and other outlying areas of Michigan, it was left to the city to deal with. And that's how that earlier photo in Toledo showed up. There wasn't a lot of immediate action up front. Trees looked fine, and then they had these rapid die-offs, which creates a lot of concern and impacts. So this is a little quote from Deb McCullough. She's an entomologist at Michigan State. She's been on the forefront of developing this exponential death curve, as well with Cliff Sadoff at Purdue and a couple other entomologists. And basically this is the model that now they are recommending, to be aware of and to manage to. And that is at low levels, when the beetle's there, you don't really see much symptoms, but there is a beetle population there building up. And as we showed earlier, once that beetle population builds up, you have that rapid die-off. So, what's that impact? Well, you've got property value. This tree is actually from Walden neighborhood over by where I live. We've got a lot of mature ash trees providing value to the city, as well as to, private homeowners. Probably one of the biggest challenges is not only when you lose that tree, you're changing the whole environment that was in. So the shade that's providing for your lawn and other bedding plants, increased watering, all the other maintenance issues that come up by removing a lot of mature trees at one time. This is a photo from one of our research studies in Chicago. And one of the key things to understand, too, we said they all die off, but they die basically at the same rate. You can see here all the way down that street, all of the mature ash trees are basically at the same level of death. This is from Fort Wayne. Chad Tinkle is the city forester there. He's been very outgoing. He's talked a couple times here at symposiums, and he's talked around the country. He's really outgoing about getting, basically, don't let what happened to Fort Wayne happen to you. And so he's shared a lot of his information and knowledge, and you'll see some more photos here. But again, you can see how the exponential death curve hit Fort Wayne. It was first discovered there in 2006. 2009, the street trees still looked, fine. By 2011, he was losing 3,000 to 4,000 trees on an annual basis out of a total population of 16. And now he's basically down to just standing dead trees and trying to get them removed. So you've got, the key, these are from him. His key impacts that he brought forth was the economics, environmental, public safety, and political issues of this. So, with some of those impacts, what I wanted to do, here tonight, show real quick of where we're at. And if I can get this pointer to work without shutting everything down. How do we go? I might not be able to figure this out. Anyway, if you look at the curve there from the parking lot in front of, this is top-down picture of City Hall. If you look at where the 23 is, those are all ash trees that wrap that curve. All the trees out here are mature ash trees. So it's a monoculture, beautiful canopy in the summer. So what I did is I just went on iTree, which is a U.S.-funded, basically tree benefit calculator. You can put in there, it gives you all the different stats based by the U.S. Forest Service, co-developed with Davey. And I put in one tree. So the circled tree there, rough DBH, 25-inch DB, it's a fairly good mature tree. What's the value of that from a street tree? Well, that single tree is going to capture 3,500 gallons of groundwater from rainfall, which is not going down quickly into the gutter. It's going to capture 1,300 pounds of carbon dioxide annually with a value of $119 to the city in calculated benefits. And, it's a growing benefit. And 11 years from now, you're looking at $153 for the value of that tree. And I did a quick math. It's napkin math, but those ash trees on that curve, I did a quick analysis. That's capturing about 120 gallons offset of carbon dioxide from those ash trees, from that row of ash trees, what they're going to capture. So it's, when you start putting that across a whole city or a whole metro like we are in the Twin Cities, there's a huge impact from losing these trees rapidly. This is from the first site. Our company found the first site in St. Paul in 2009, and I wanted to share this photo. I didn't retouch in property signs here, but that was just by chance. It's a great point to show. But the big impact here is specifically not only to the property value, but once the city removed all those trees, look at the grass burns out. There's not shade there. That grass, everything there was designed for that. And some cities have reported up to 33% increase in water use once the mature trees are removed, because now everyone's watering to offset that shade. Additional, we've got more watering plus less ability to sequester groundwater. So a lot of that's running down our gutters. Some from the liability public safety risk. This photo here is another one that Chad Tinkle shared with us, and you can see this ash through a dead limb. This was on a calm, not windy day, not from a storm, just drops. And Terry mentioned earlier, ash trees, they dry out quick. So when they die, they start drying out, they get brittle, and they become unsafe to climb, and they become challenges to remove. So if you're going to remove your trees, you want to remove them when they're healthy. Once they start declining, they become more costly to deal with, more dangerous. A lot of companies, I know Davey Nationwide has put in a do not climb. They won't send climbers up in dying ash trees because of safety. So now you're getting into more costly equipment removals, as well as different techniques that are going to have more impact. I know in Fort Wayne they've had multiple broken sidewalks and curbs from removing trees. Just because they can't do them as they got to do them more recklessly, I guess is an easy way to put it. So it's good to get the trees out while you can. Don't let them stand. This is another one from Fort Wayne. This is could be very similar to a lot of Burnsville neighborhoods, especially in River Hills. And so what's the overall look and impact that's going to face our city? We can't get away from it. EAB's here to stay in the metro. We've got to deal with it. And so the question I have is, think about that from a citywide perspective. So any questions on impact before we go into some of the changes to the plan?
Mr. Chair, please.
It seems to me that we recognized this in 2010, that it was coming, that it was going to happen, and we at least talked some about proactive measures we might take, rather than just waiting for all the trees to die at once and to have all the cost fall on the city and its residents all at one time. Some thoughts about what we might do, including, it seems to me we at least discussed the idea of being proactive and even taking out healthy trees on some sort of a schedule so that we get some renewal. If you went through and took out some of the trees now and planted maples or something else, you wouldn't see those boulevards of dead trees. There would be dead trees coming, but you wouldn't have that hard, immediate impact. And I don't recall exactly where we ended up in terms of the plan. It does seem to me that we decided that we wouldn't go out of our way to protect some trees. But
Yeah, Commissioner Wolf, absolutely. We have started to remove some of those low-quality ash trees. The funding hasn't gotten to the level where we can do a lot of it, to be honest. Most of the funding, we started setting aside $50,000 a year in 2011, right after we adopted the plan. And a lot of that money and time has gone into the inventory, which we're going to share, those numbers with you tonight, and that was our top priority. But we did start removing some ash trees. Obviously, we're not promoting planting ash trees at this point, and we've done some of that. Our city forester here is Dave Gramish. Dave, I want to say 30 or 40 trees a year. Is that kind of what you've been doing for the last couple of years?
It's probably not been quite that high, but we've been trying to shoot for the 30. Last year was probably 12. We ended up with a lot of storms. The year before that, we did 30 trees and planted, I think, 8 back in on the homeowner's request. So we kind of left it up to the homeowners for replanting, and we used a diverse tree population to put back in. But there's a strong resistance on when you go to someone's house and you want to take down a fully mature tree for no reason. In their eyes, we know the EAB is coming. We want to get it down, but the average homeowner wants to save that big tree in their yard, and that's some of the issues that we're dealing with right now and how to resolve that. So,
Commissioner Wolf, so we've been doing some of it. It's kind of been as time allows and as resources allow, but I think we really need to gear up for, obviously, EAB is much closer now than we knew 3 years ago, and I do think we need to step that up at this point. We'll talk more about that as we present the plan, too.
Mr. Chair. Joel, question. Yes. Are you going to speak to the injections for the trees that people...
Treatments? Yeah. The tree injection?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can. It's not specifically in here, but we could capture that towards the end if time permits. Yep. Yep.
Anybody ask questions? I have one question. So you have talked about knowing where the infection is.
Yep.
And just, we already know that if the infection is already here, do we have any idea that how far, if this tree, like a mile before you have found it, 3 miles they already are infected? Do you have any kind of educated guess
Yeah,
that you're
there-
going with and saying all of these trees we can't see it, but we know that they're already infected?
There's some good data out there for that. There's a couple factors first. One is just because we find it here doesn't mean it's not someplace else. It's just where we found it. So there's a lot of like when we find it, it's like the first place we found it. People assume that's the first place the bug came into the community. So that's where I think the Fort Snelling is good for that, because that find was older than a lot of other finds that had been done. So that's one aspect. That's the randomness of it, because that tree in St. Paul where it was first found in 2009, that tree had been standing dead for multiple years. The homeowner never did anything with it. So, if someone doesn't report it, trees get removed that were infested, and you never know. So taking that aside from knowing where it's at, they've shown that EAB will basically be within a half mile or so of where you find it feeding. It's not really going long distance to look for other food sources. As long as there's readily can feed, it will continue to feed on the same tree. That's how it kills the tree, because you get a few beetles feeding, the tree can handle the damage, and finally that population builds up to there in a 1 or 2 year period. The tree's overwhelmed with that annual feeding and it dies. Now, they've actually put this bug in a wind tunnel and tested it. Imagine that. It can go about 12 to 14 miles if it has to. So it can seek a long distance if it needs to, or then you get moved from people moving firewood, which is how a lot of the new sites, that's why you see so much about don't move firewood. People are moving it around manually, as well as you get storms. If it blows a fertilized female, it can create a new site. So there's a lot of variables. The challenge is people get lulled to sleep. There's no new finds, and then I think, Don, you mentioned earlier there's been 3 finds this winter, 4 finds outside of areas that we would have suspected it to be, and it's just people start finding it.
Thank you.
Does that answer?
Yes,
It's
thank you.
kind of complicated a little bit.
No,
Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate
Great. So, to the point that Brian had earlier was on, let's see if I get this. Your plan that you had was a well planned out plan, a lot of good, future in it. And, as the plans we see, it was a pretty good plan. And so all we did was really look at what's the new information we have, the exponential death curve, and different things, treatment options, what's the research showing that would improve or give you more tools to manage the problem. So with that, and then also really knowing every tree you have and where their habit and the health of that tree is important. So that has been accomplished. And so we have the information, the knowledge to really start putting together a pretty tight action plan, and that's what I'm going to go through here. So as we mentioned earlier, the original plan was pretty straightforward: removing 12,000 trees, planting 12,000 trees, and then protecting some key vital area trees of 240 at an estimated cost of $14 million. The good news is the price goes way down. Bad news is you still got to deal with EAB. And, the key things with EAB is, which we just went over, which you're aware of and you've addressed, is the liability of it, from a public safety. What we're looking at moving forward is protecting more of the trees, which is a big change. And a lot of that has to do, we'll talk a little bit about the value of those trees versus just removing them prematurely. And then, one of the key factors to this whole thing is managing the canopy. We've got a very more mature canopy city. People buy, houses because of that. That's where they want to live. And so how do we maintain that until we have to get rid of it or transition it out? And this plan is more focused on transitioning that canopy versus going to just a clear-cut approach and then having a bunch of small trees. So that it's a, you know, a more, I guess, easy way for people to deal with it from an impact standpoint. So, you know, the original, you know, 12,000 trees, where did that, you know, come from? You know, there was a lot of estimates, and once was started looking at it and looking at actual results is a lot of those 12,000 trees sit right out of the city's responsibility. So they may still appear to be a street tree, but they're actually a private tree because of distance away, and it's a 15-foot easement, and so that reduced a lot of the population of the trees that the city is actually responsible for, as well as some of them were based on Dakota County estimates, you know, because we didn't have a solid inventory. So the new inventory, we got 3,040 boulevard trees, street trees, which when you look at that percent, 24%, that's still a high percentage of your trees. You remove, you know, 25%, there's going to be an impact, especially in certain neighborhoods. Terry has them. We don't have them here, you know, in the plant tonight, but there is the inventories. And, you know, just from driving around, you can know that, you know, like River Hills, high population of ash. Around City Hall, high population of ash compared to southwest Burnsville. So the park ash trees, 932, 14,000 in woodland areas. And then the estimated, we did some estimated surveys to determine what's the private trees, because now, you know, just because they're not state trees, it's still going to impact, you know, public safety and how we see the community. 22,000. So there's a lot of trees on private, in private backyards. So from a public tree strategy approach, you know, if you take the park trees and the street trees, that's 3,900 ash trees roughly, you know, that you're looking at dealing with. And in that, we're looking at removing 1,100 of them. So these are trees, low value, probably should get rid of anyway. Low value to the city, they could be even hazardous, they've got defects. But keeping the trees that have high value until their service life is out. So that's the big change of going from treating 240 to treating 2,800 of them. And this photo here that I'm using example is actually from University of Ohio. This is a research trial that we did with them in Toledo. These are the last remaining street trees in Toledo. The trees here that are thinned out, they're actually been removed, but this was a research trial with treatments to see the effectiveness of treatments during that high pressure. So there's plenty of research we can share with you later on treatments work, different treatment options. There's multiple options. And the net benefit then is that we're basically, all the benefits those trees are bringing to us, from aesthetics to all the values, property values, we're preserving that until we need to remove them. And it also does another thing is just removing that many trees in a short period of time can be very expensive and disrupt a lot of neighborhoods and just ways of life. Here we can remove these as they just naturally lose their value. You know, they're going to mature. Every tree has a life cycle. When they hit that end of the life cycle, we would have removed it anyway. That would have been our responsibility. We're just choosing to wait and do that then versus prematurely remove it on healthy, high-value trees. So that's on the street trees and park trees. Woodland trees, as Terry alluded to earlier, all we're going to do is let those go to natural selection. They're in the woods. Any tree that would be deemed a public risk, in other words, close to trails or something, those will be identified and removed. But a lot of these trees are smaller trees. There's not a high density. So if a few of them die, it's not like we're going to see big dead areas of our parks or woodland areas. So, you know, the consensus is let Mother Nature take its course. Nature will reseed and new trees, diverse canopy will come up. Private trees with, the big thing there is, you know, they're private trees, or they're the homeowner's responsibility, but we want to make sure they're using proper treatments. You mentioned that earlier. Encourage them to take action. The same thing the city's doing, the homeowner has to look at. Should I remove that tree? Should I treat it? What do I replant? What do I replant with? So to get that outreach out there so they can make the best decision they can. We've seen around the country, if no one takes the lead, there's a lot of ambulance chasers. Different people are going to come in and offer, want to remove trees or not even ash trees, and telling the homeowner it's an ash tree. So getting that awareness out there is important. And the benefit to the city on that is, you know, the overall look and feel, but also these trees are trees that are breeding beetles. So if they're dying, and we're not addressing it somehow, it's just creating a higher beetle population that's going to affect our public trees. So it's good to manage it from the whole urban forest perspective. So this is kind of how the numbers break up and kind of the key strategy points. As we mentioned earlier, we've started to remove poor quality trees, as well as this is for 2013 proposal to remove trees of that, start moving those 1,100 trees, but also hire an EAB coordinator to manage a lot of this process. 2014 is through 2017, and the assumption here is that EAB shows up either sometime in 2013 or early 2014. And so this moving forward from 2014 is more of once EAB is here approach. So if we don't find it for a couple of years, this would give us more time. But for the example tonight, in 2014, we want to really start looking at phasing in treatments of legacy trees, high-value ash trees, remove the ones we want to remove, get that done, as well as get the public awareness out. So we have good education out there. 2018, 2019, as we know, once it goes through, it happens quick. We should be on the downhill slide of EAB. And at that point, we would still continuing trees that are deemed high value, as well as, still getting the public outreach, tree planting message out. And at that point, I think it would be appropriate to review the EAB strategy. I mean, this is something that's a major importance nationwide, a lot of research, a lot of government funding and knowledge going into this. We'll know more. That photo I shared with you earlier from Toledo, we're actually continuing that research. Toledo's pretty much wiped out with ash trees, but we're continuing to fund and look at different management options, to see what happens 7, 8 years past EAB. Do we have to treat anymore? There's theories out there, different ways. It could act more like a native pest. We have bronze birchboard and two-line chestnut. We're on oaks. They're the same family as EAB. So those they just really attack stress trees. We don't know. So at that point, we would relook at the plan, see what we needed to do. And then 2020 through 2023, possibly phase out treatments. In the budget, that number there is with the perspective that we would continue to do treatments, but may or may not be needed, as well as really ramp up tree planting. So the breakdown for all the different categories are there in front of you. The top line, there's a dollar amount for the total cost for 2013 through 2023, as well, or 11-year cycle, as well as what either trees are being removed, treated, or planted. So with that, any questions?
Mr. Chairman, if I could just add a couple of things. We left you in front of your seats an updated page 15, which has the revised cost that Joel just shared with you. That was changed a little bit from what was put on the website on Friday as part of your background packets. So these are the updated numbers that you have in front of you. And then I just wanted to share that we did get an email from a resident in Southwest Burnsville questioning why, in wooded areas in parklands we would allow kind of natural selection to occur. Why wouldn't we do that for large private wooded areas? And I think it's a very good question, and I think we should treat those areas the same. And so I've also shared with you some language that staff is proposing we add to the plan, which basically says that private woodland areas, we used an area of 1 acre or more that we would they would be allowed to mimic the strategies that the city's using. So ash trees would be allowed to die and decay in place unless, of course, they create a public safety concern or neighborhood nuisance. And neighborhood nuisance means if your tree dies and falls, it might fall on my house or my fence or my kids or my dog or something like that. So we would suggest that we add that language so that those larger private woodland areas would be managed similar to the publicly owned woodland areas.
Terry, question on that. Would that be like an aggregate? What happens if there's multiple property where they share a wooded area that make up an acre or a little larger than an acre? Is it one ownership that equals 1 acre, or could it be multiple ownership that equals out to an aggregate of an acre or more?
Commissioner Dedze, I guess I hadn't thought through the combining of areas. The intent is if there's a large wooded area and it wants to be managed that way, that would make sense. I'm trying to think of a situation where that, with a townhouse association, I suppose that could.
I'm just saying,
could
there are, I
happen
think, there could be some areas where there's multiple ownership, where there is wooded areas that are not owned by one individual, multiple individuals that make up that, but it's still an acre, and I think that probably should be addressed, because
Yeah.
it's still,
I think the intent would be that we should include those areas.
right, I would
Allow
too.
that to happen, yeah.
It's just that it's been split up a little bit, but it's still an acre or larger wooded area, but doesn't stand as separate. It's still a lot of wood. So does that make
That's
sense?
a very good point, and I think we should tweak the language to reflect that unless commissioners have concerns over that.
Mr. Chair?
Mr. Wolf, please.
It would still be within the city's decision-making authority as to enforce taking out the trees on any size property, right? So I think it's important to get some sort of language in there that would give the city the authority to move when it feels it's necessary. And you can always back off from that as you feel it's appropriate, I would think. So in other words, let's say you put in a language that it's an acre for a given homeowner. If you went into an area, and I think my yard might be an example of exactly what you're talking about. Nobody has developed the backs. And so combined, there's far more than an acre of wooded area there, but individuals may not all own an acre. But I guess my thinking is that you wouldn't have to go back there and demand that those trees be taken out. The key is to have it in the language so that you can take it out if you feel necessary, correct?
Very, very good point, Commissioner Wolf. If you read the ordinance, it says the city may underline, require a homeowner to remove an infested or diseased trees. It is at the city's discretion. One of the ways we could handle it is just remove the 1 acre or more and say that'll be our strategy for large woodland areas, and rather than make it a per property owner thing, leave it up to the city's discretion. With our intent being to allow those combined areas where the tree isn't a hazard, to allow it to go through the natural process.
Mr. Chair. One other question. Do we have it covered also for utilities that have areas that have wooded areas, and how that's being handled?
Commissioner Dedze, utilities, normally they keep their lines clear.
Power
So
lines,
you wouldn't,
yeah.
their power, so they
But-
wouldn't allow.
But again,
Ash trees normally-
there's a lot of wooded areas around a lot of utility areas. So, I mean, yes, they'll usually clear a path so you can get a truck through or something of that sort, but I just wondered if there's any discussion or any comments about utility areas.
Nationwide, it's a huge concern with the utilities. I just read one from Kansas City they're panicking because they just found it there, and they don't believe they have the clearance. It would really get into so we're Excel in Dakota. It would really get into finding out what their management plan is and easement, because they do try to clear back, but if a standing tree dies, that changes that easement, because you got a 60-foot tree that you're dealing with, or a 40-foot tree versus a 15-foot branch. So but that would get into that would be their responsibility. I don't know.
Commissioner Dedze, you're concerned about the trees that are next to the easement that might fall onto the
Well,
power
I'm just
line.
concerned that we've got private citizens and we've got public trees, and these trees are now by utility type companies. I'm just wondering if we're having anything addressing those particular woodland areas.
My reaction is because of the nature of the business of the utility companies, they're going to want to have those ash trees removed so that they don't impact their power source. The question, though, would be the neighboring properties where an ash tree may fall onto the power line. I would think that would fall under the heading of public nuisance, and then the city would say you need to go in and remove that tree, because it has the potential to knock the power out for the entire neighborhood if you're not taking care of that tree. So I would think we would ask them to at least get it down on the ground in those situations. And I do think we have that authority in our ordinance.
Commissioner?
Joel, another question about the inoculating of trees. I was at a conference about a year ago, and there were at least 7 different groups who were saying, I'll come and save your tree, and the price went from A to Z. And, you know, apparently the treatment of trees does work. So one of the things that would be useful for the city to do, again, is either find out a private contractor that could be used citywide, like garbage disposal kind of thing, that kind of a plan, instead of everybody and their uncle running off and saying, you know, calling Joe or Dave or Harold to come in and do something. I mean, if we could make sense out of the treatment program, you know, it would save everyone a lot of money and a lot of worries. So, you know, it's just something that right now I'm uncomfortable with, because we haven't really talked about that and how the city can help the private people without putting city money in it, but at least organizing something and identifying people so there's some consistency of treatment. My other question at some point is what kind of trees are being used in replacement right now?
We're using a number of varieties, locust, linden, hackberry, ginkgo, the new elms, oaks, and of course we'll add some maples in there if they meet the criteria for being in the boulevard area on there.
What is being talked about on the boulevard areas that would have some kind of canopy?
Those varieties would be ones we'd use.
All those?
Those are my replacements to meet our goals of our diversity.
But
downtown.
we said once before, no more lines of trees that are all the same.
Right, and we do have that in our policy. We do have a 30-20-10 policy on the species that can go in with the diversity. So you won't have an oak next to somebody else. It'll be a different variety. So we've got a list of trees that we'll use. So you won't have probably two trees the same variety next to each other or
I
species.
think that would help organizations like homeowners associations that, you know, dealing with that issue. So again, maybe something to down the road when it gets towards more implementation, some of those issues could be put out there.
Mr. Chair.
Steve, do you have,
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair.
and then
Joel, I
Yes.
just have a question. I'd just like to get some understanding of treatment. Could you describe the treatment and how it affects the EAB's life cycle, and how long do you treat the tree?
Right now there's 3 what we'd consider approved treatment methods, and these are ones that have been screened by different universities. Some of the universities that I've mentioned, Ohio, Michigan, Michigan State, Illinois, Minnesota is newly signed on. This is a group, they're basically call it it's an EAB task force of entomologists, and they screen these treatments and they test them, and we do a lot of research with them, and so do other manufacturers. And so they're trying to really, I mean, that's kind of like the holy grail. If they give the stamp, it works. If it doesn't, buyer beware. One thing to understand on treatments too is the EPA governs the proper use of products. They don't necessarily screen the effectiveness. In other words, that's usually up to the manufacturer to prove and sell. Now with emerald ash borer, with invasive pests, I believe it was in 2009 or 8 they started implementing that if it's an invasive pest, the manufacturer actually has to show data that it works when they submit. But the reason I say this, there's a lot of products that do claim to have control on EAB that don't work, or don't work very well, or don't work on large trees, but they may work on small trees. So there's a lot of stuff to go through on the internet and whatever to do. All that being said, there's 3 products, and I'll go by their active ingredient because they have multiple brand names, but there's imidacloprid, which is originally by Bayer, but there's a lot of different brand names of imidacloprid. There is Dynatefron, which is a bark spray type product that there is, I believe, one retail product coming out, but then it's a professional product offered by a couple manufacturers. And these are both either a soil applied or you spray the bark, and the products are systemic. So they soak in either through the root system or through the bark. They move up and they're in that vascular system of the tree. So when the eggs hatch, that larvae goes in their feed, they digest it and die. So that's really what you're targeting, is that when the eggs go in, that you're killing the larvae. The third kind, and that's the primarily one that is in this plan, and that's what will be used on the boulevard trees, and that is a product, it's ivermectin benzoate. You may have heard of it by the brand name Triage, and it is one that's injected directly into the tree. And then it's systemic, they're all systemic, and then as the larvae feed, they die. So there's three kind of application methods and technologies out there. There's a fourth one that just came online. It's a OMRE approved product. We're testing it right now. It's been used in Canada, developed by the Canadian Forest Service, and it's an injected one. And it's shown good results there, but we're trying to test it in the States to see if we get similar results, because we have bigger trees. And so that's where, that's why there's no specific lockdown, one method, one way in this plan, because as technologies change, cost is a big factor. These products all have variability in cost, as well as when new things come on, there's repellents being tested. And I mean, as this moves forward, there's going to be new and improved technologies. Now, how long do you have to treat? As long as, a couple factors there. One is, as long as the EAB is around, you're going to have to treat your tree. The other one, though, with knowing that beetle population, how it builds, and this is what we're looking at long term, we know the trees can take that attack on a single year when the population's low. That's why it hovers, because the trees don't show a lot of symptoms, and then all of a sudden they die. Well, knowing that, as well as knowing that it takes a high beetle population to kill large trees, down the road, once that high beetle population's gone through, all of the unprotected trees are dead. Now you have a very limited food source. That beetle population crashes. So then it's looking at, can you skip years? Can you skip multiple years? We don't know, and that's what we're looking at in research. So the theories are out there is that after post-EAB, you may be able to skip 3 or 4 years. So the tree injection product, it's a 2-year treatment. You treat 2 years, wait 2 years, retreat. You're really on a 4 to 6 year cycle, and so that's where price goes really cheap then, to manage trees versus removing them and not because the other thing you have to do is you remove a tree. You just took out a 17 or 20 inch tree. I'm 43. I live here in Burnsville. It's my lifetime before we get that tree back. So it's not removing them to me is definitely a valid option on a something that's an unworthy tree, but a nice mature tree in a given area. From I'm going to go on my citizen standpoint here for a second and say it changes the community for my lifetime if we don't do what we can to keep them.
Joel, Mr. Chairman, can you just talk a little bit about the drench method and some of the environmental concerns in particular?
Yeah, there's been there's the drench method is a lot of it you'll see is in imidacloprid. You see it at the Home Depots. It's Bear Advanced. There's other products. There's a couple key things to know about that. First, the stuff you buy at retail, there's only one brand out there that actually works on large trees. The rates are too low to be effective on small trees. That's one of the key things with outreach. What we've seen around the country, a lot of cities will post information on current research. So, like to your point, homeowners can make smart decisions. That method is you either drench it right around the base of the tree, it soaks in, tree uptakes it. The other option is you can soil inject it, where you're not disturbing the soil, it goes into the ground, the tree uptakes it. We chose in this plan not to use that for boulevard trees because of the potential of hardpan and runoff into the gutter. Now, soil injecting that would minimize that. However, with this plan, we're looking at doing tree injections there and then reserving those options for park trees and areas that are not close to hard surfaces. And the key factor, the reason why people consider it is it's a fraction of the cost compared to tree injection. You can treat a tree in 5 minutes versus a half hour to an hour with the tree injection. So there's a big labor issue there.
And drenching is in essence pouring the chemical
Yep.
around the base of the tree.
Yep, you just simply pour around there. And then the other one I talked about was a bark spray, and it's basically you're using 1 to 2 ounces per dBH, which is the diameter of the tree, and you're basically just wetting it and it soaks in. And as soon as it dries, the contact, I mean, there's no concern with exposure.
Commissioner Wolf, you
Yeah.
had a question?
I'm willing to pass, maybe come back.
Mr. Chair, just going back to one question on our acreage, that we're going to let nature take its
Yes.
course. Being a tree person, what can we expect? You made comment that we'll let nature and then natural growth will occur. What can we expect of what that natural growth will look like? What is it going to be made up of?
Dave might have, probably buckthorn. I mean, unfortunately, you're looking at buckthorn, box elders come in really quick. It depends on the area. One aspect of it could be, which we didn't address in the plan, is the city could look at, managing that wild area. I mean, let natural selection come up, but then go and selectively remove unwanted plants and species. Because once that dies, it's really gets.
Well, I was just looking at it from additional cost, that
Yeah.
even though our cost has come down, we've also spent money to clear out buckthorn, and so I was just trying to see what other costs we might have
Yep.
on stuff that we are not taking down. So
Unfortunately, a lot of the trees that we don't deem as high value are the ones that come in quick. If you look at it, that would be something to consider. Now, I can't remember.
we just need to put more value on buckthorn then.
Yeah. Find a good commercial use for it. And we didn't look. We do have the woodland survey information. I don't know what the density is, and that would be more of an issue, I think, if you had areas where you had high density being removed, where you created big open space, where it'd be more desirable for plants to come back in. But if you're missing a tree here and there, it may not be as impactful.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioners, any other questions? Mr. Wolf or Mr.
None from me. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ben? Anybody else?
Mr. Chairman, one other comment, and then, hopefully you'll be prepared to make a recommendation this evening. I do have one item that Commissioner Nachman brought up that I need some follow-up on where the commission's at, and Commissioner Nachman, let me know if I've captured it correctly. But I think what you were suggesting is that we look at kind of organizing a treatment contract that private homeowners could access.
Yes.
And that is not in the plan currently. That has been done in other communities. We talked about it.
You have some models for that.
So, that could be, and it currently isn't. For us, it was a matter of, we've got one staff person we're going to hire. The rest of this service will be contracted out. So we're not going to gear up our staff. We're going to use private contractors ourselves. And so we were just going to devote that person's time towards public trees. We did put a line item in there for kind of private support that we aren't sure what that would look like, but that could be one of the things we do for private property support. So if you're feeling that way, that is certainly something that we could put into the plan, and it would be nice to know that this evening. And I think what you're suggesting is we would kind of talk to contractors and get in theory, a reduced price that our residents could choose to use that contractor.
Yes.
So if we could have some follow-up discussion or direction for staff in that regard, it'd be helpful.
That'd be good. Commissioners, what do you think?
So you're proposing maybe an amendment to our recommendation to approve this? Is that what you're proposing?
Yeah, Commissioner Nachman, I don't want to make it in the form of a motion for you. That's up to the
No.
commissioners, but I think just discussion on where you are all at. If you think that's a good idea, it would be under the strategies for private property owners, and the city would kind of facilitate pulling together contracts.
Commissioner Wolf?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you explain that in just a little more detail? Are you suggesting sort of a franchise that somebody who met certain criteria would be contracting with the city to provide residents with lower cost treatment, or would it just be a matter of vetting qualified individuals? I guess I'm not quite sure that I understand the scope of this, and I'm a little concerned about the city dictating to private individuals how they go about treating their trees. That's always a concern to me. I understand both sides of the question. You want to protect the citizenry from all the charlatans that are out there, but I have to admit, as a citizen, I get really frustrated with all the regulations and so forth that keep me from taking care of things the way I think is best on my own property. So I'd like to know just a little bit more of what we see ourselves doing.
To clarify what you said, this isn't mandated. I would say the city would provide that service for those that are interested. For people that want to do their own, that's fine. But then they're at their own risk of finding out who is credible and who isn't credible. But the city will have someone that we know is trustworthy and can do it at a volume and reducing the cost. But, you know, I think anybody can do whatever they want other than that.
Dan, go ahead, please.
Mr. Chair, I think within our current tree policy, we already certify arborists for trees.
Correct. We have all tree contractors are licensed, so
Yeah.
that is always posted on our website, and it was actually driven by this plan to implement that. So
Yeah. So-
we know that if they work off of that license list, they should be certified, they have the right insurance and the right level of knowledge to do the job right.
I think, to me, that is in with the scope we're talking about. We're already covered, on that.
Mr. Chairman, you may want to have Joel or let him talk about what he's seen in other parts of the country, because I know there are other cities that have done this. Might help frame it for you.
Yeah, there's in specifically that there's like two options to go. One is simply just these are approved contractors that do certain treatment methods, and that they've been approved by the city. So that's kind of that licensing thing. I think more what you're speaking of, what cities have done in the past, is when they put out their contracts for bid, they will include that the private citizen can access those same low prices based upon quality, the quantity that they're doing. So they would still work through the city wouldn't manage it. It would be, they would hire that contractor privately, but the contractor would agree to give that same rate and treatment method that the city's getting to the homeowners of that city. So it's really a cost savings approach. And now some other cities have done, I believe is it Coon Rapids? No. There's another city, Arlington Heights, or someone here locally. What they did was they secured, now they went to a more restricted policy, and I think this might be more what you're talking about, Brian, where they dictated a specific treatment option that the city, they were mandating to be done in the city. And then what they did is they approved multiple contractors that would fit the criteria. That's a more restrictive approach that probably takes a little bit more challenging to manage. But from what I was understanding, it's just simply what you were looking at, just simply giving that volume discount access to citizens, which is...
I guess what you just described is what I would like
Yeah.
to do. So we make it a motion or whatever it is, but
Contract.
that would be the concept.
Commissioner Wolf, you had a
Just clarification, when you said that's what you'd like to do, you are saying that what you would like to do is have the contractor for the city agree to provide those same rates to private property owners?
Yeah. Yes.
And that seems to be a pretty, that's a, I don't want to say standard practice, but that's a pretty common practice with this, because it gets into a lot of trees and cost of doing it. And it's good for the city. The more trees that get treated, the less impact you have.
I have no objection to that, as long as the homeowner is
the right.
allowed the option of going with another firm or company if they so wish. And I thought I made a very good point that we cover some of this already with our approved list, and so I think we're in good shape.
Commissioners, a similar type program we do is we do a bulky item collection every year where the city solicits proposals from haulers to pick up sofas, big items, curbside from residents. We do it during I Love Burnsville week, and we get a reduced rate from a vendor. We have them, all the licensed ones can submit, proposals, and then we pick the one that's the best value for the citizens, and then they just work with that contractor direct to get their items picked up and pay them direct. And we're pretty much out of the loop at that point once we've selected a contractor. But it does take some time to get the proposals and pull that stuff together.
Questions?
No, just thank you for explaining. I wasn't really sure what.
Yeah,
what
good. Good discussion.
going
Thank you,
back there.
Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. So Terry, do we need to make a recommendation, or?
Staff would love to have a recommendation from you this evening. We are going to take this item on to City Council at their April 9th work session. If you want to add that element about us kind of organizing that volume pricing for private citizens, you could just incorporate that into your motion.
Also move to approve the plan, and with the advice of including that volume discount. That's a good idea.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Enough. So motion passed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for your time. The next item is miscellaneous. Commissioners, any miscellaneous item you'd like to report?
Not unless you can control the weather.
Staff, any items you'd like to add or report?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess the only item we would like to share is that the next PNRC meeting is scheduled for May 6th at 6:30 p.m.
Thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of our formal meeting agenda. Commissioner, would you like to make a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So moved.
Second.
I'll second.
I'll second. All say aye, please.
Aye.
Thank you, and good evening, and thank you for watching the Burnsville Park and National Resource meeting.